Good afternoon, and welcome to our session, which is part of a series that we're running on next generation public affairs, where we, in each session, look at approaches or tools that are not yet in wide use in EU public affairs, but are becoming staples of public affairs elsewhere in the world, and will no doubt be staples here in Brussels and around Europe at some point very soon. I'm very pleased to have the excellent Paul Hillier with me from TACTiX. He'll introduce himself shortly and his company. And I know he's probably too humble to say that the work he's doing using AI to determine public opinion or the opinion of specific groups like policymakers really is world leading. So it's a great catch, and I'm glad to have him with us today. So at the agency I work for, Rud Pedersen, we have actually worked with TACTiX a number of times on projects to determine the exact views and perceptions of quite narrow groups of policymakers and constituents from specific places on topics specific to the clients in question. And we've been able to really determine not just general interest, but also how passionately these people feel about the topics in question, which has really helped us define message, define strategy. So super useful. But enough from me. I'll let Paul kick off. Just quickly on how we will run this. We're going to keep it simple. Paul's going to kick off with a brief introduction and an example of the tool at work, and then we'll shift to Q&A. I've got a bunch of questions myself, but please pitch in as soon as you want through the chat function. List your questions, and I'll pick them out. And Paul, who as mentioned is the star of the show, will no doubt show us some of the magic that he's able to concoct. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you. All right, magic that we can concoct. That's a high bar to start with, but really glad to be here. Glad to be talking about deep learning and where it fits into public affairs. Glad for human contact. Toronto is still sheltering in place, so this totally counts as human contact. And glad to be talking about Europe here today. We do work all over the world, but I think there's a couple of things that specifically are wonderful about working in a European domain. One is the languages are much simpler in comparison to places like Asia. The languages issue, when you start thinking about how to aggregate large amounts of data, is a lot simpler. So that's nice. The second thing is that there's nowhere else in the world where the precautionary principle rules quite as strongly. So there's never a shortage of content on controversial topics to parse through. But I think the third one is, the role that Europe plays in terms of the global impacts that it has elsewhere. Policymakers in Brussels very much play a key role exporting regulations, if we can say that. So that's why we're excited to be here. The firm that I'm with, TACTiX, we've been around 25 years and have built up this niche in the area of risk communications and deep learning. And so we have those two components there. So I thought it'd be worthwhile starting why we see a need for these types of tools in public affairs. Maybe throw the gauntlet down a little bit on why some of the other traditional thinking is of the past, and then turn myself over to Stefan for a rigorous set of questions. So let me share a screen with a study that we recently just did here. So when we start thinking about deep learning and doing a deep dive on what it is people actually are thinking, whether that's constituents in a small area, policymakers at a national level, really what we're trying to do is look at what their behaviors are on social media, how things are being processed through news media, look through global search trends, and trying to get at what people are actually thinking. And so I think the important place to start is that in most major companies, public affairs is one of the last areas to start to adopt artificial intelligence. R&D uses it. The accounting department uses it for fraud prevention, operations. Pretty conservative parts of the company are all in on AI. And I'd have to say that the public affairs is probably the one bringing up the vanguard. So that's why we're excited to be here. The second thing that I'd note is the sophistication of activist groups. If anyone working in any of these topics up here on the board don't have a copy of Chris Rose's How to Win Campaigns book, I think it's important to be able to understand how the activist community successfully runs campaigns. So that's what we're trying to get up to the level. And the third piece that I'd mention is that polling doesn't work the way we think it does. So if we're starting to think about how people process risk, how people get worried about something, whether those people are policymakers or the general public, asking them, are you worried about cosmetics? Are you worried about pesticides? Doesn't work the way we think it does. And there's all sorts of examples and can talk about psychology of false introspection. My personal favorite way to sum this problem up is a fairly famous study where people were asked about God. And this is an interesting way to start a webinar here, but they were asked about their opinions about God. And they were asked, does God cause more good in the world or harm in the world? And people overwhelmingly said more good. But if you looked at behaviors and you looked at how people actually think and act, and when do they attribute something to God in their real life, it's when something wrong happens. And so we have this disconnect between what people think they think and what they actually think. That seems a little esoteric, so to bring it home a little bit, we were running one of these studies in the plastics sector, and previously had seen polling information that said the public blames consumers when there's littered plastic in the streets. That's what people say and think they think. What they actually think is they blame companies and they blame the manufacturers. So that's the disconnect. The problem with trying to get at what people think by just asking them. Instead, what we do is figure out how people talk about an issue organically. And so my last segue out of, if I'm going to introduce a word like organic with pesticides up here on the board, we were running a study about a year ago, and when you start talking about why people love organics, and the pesticide sector would be certainly confident that it has everything to do with being against pesticides. And when we dig deep, how people actually form the neurological pathways and how they actually form those perceptions, it was all about the idea that organic equaled local food. Organic food equaled local food, which is far from the truth, but that's how the perceptions get made. So that's some of the issues that we raise and tackle with, and it's largely this disconnect between what people say they think and what they actually think are two very different things. So I think with that, I've thrown down a gauntlet of saying public affairs is probably one of the laggards to start to use deep learning and artificial intelligence. The activists have stepped up their game, and polling doesn't work the way we think it works. I think that's probably enough controversial things to say in the first 5 minutes here. So I'm going to stop sharing a screen, turn this back to Stefan and say, Stefan, I'm in your hands.
Super. No, thanks so much, Paul. And no, thanks for the great intro. I'm going to start off with a couple of perhaps of the easier questions.
Good.
I know as someone someone based in Brussels, what always comes engaging on pan-European issues, one of the questions that always props up is languages. Do your tools work equally well across markets and across languages? And also, how narrow can you go? Is it national? Is it regional? Can you determine what perceptions are in, amongst a very specific group of people in a specific locality, a city, for instance?
Sure. So let me start with languages and say, no, it doesn't work equally well with all languages. Farsi continues to be very difficult. Mandarin is fine, but Farsi is difficult. Other things that are challenging are places like India, where there's literally hundreds of languages in pretty small geographical regions. It's difficult. Europe is wonderfully straightforward in comparison. And in addition to the relatively smaller number of languages, before we were actually doing work in Europe, this is now 5 or 6 years ago, the tool was being trained, and we can get more into sort of how to train deep learning tools, but without nerding out too hard on that, the tool was already being trained using EU documents. There's nothing quite like the same documents being translated into dozens of languages to ensure you're standardizing a tool to start to calibrate the right way. So any language, save Farsi, is still difficult. In terms of segmenting, yeah, because we're able to build a sample size of generally about 250,000 people for one of our studies, you're able to segment it in a lot of different ways. And so whether that's based on demographics, so often we'll slice it based on gender, age, income, education, and then geography as well. So often our studies start at a national level, but then you drill in from there. Because certainly not all parts of France think the same way, not all parts of the UK think the same way. So you start to split it regionally and then down to the city level. And then you certainly touched on there, the slide that I showed a moment ago was one of the more detailed studies that we've done, and it was specifically of Brussels policymakers. And so I think I'm going to lead myself into a conversation about GDPR even accidentally, so we may as well flag that right up front. When we say we're looking at what Brussels policymakers in that study, for example, think, we're not segmenting and only looking at the accounts of Brussels policymakers. You can't do that and respect GDPR. What we're doing is starting with a large sample and saying, what are the demographics and geographics that policymakers fit? Well, they're obviously going to be within a certain geographic region. They're going to be of a certain set of demographics, and you build those narrowly enough. You don't need to know individual accounts. We're not connecting any personally identifiable information with any content. That gets separated in order to respect GDPR. So what we're doing is saying, what does a policymaker look like? And then segmenting to that. So when we build a sample, that one there was 5,200 policymakers. There's some noise. There's 4 or 5% of that population that aren't actually policymakers. Stefan, maybe you got caught up in that one as one of the 5,200 people, but with a 96% accuracy, you can be very confident of the findings while still respecting GDPR.
Thanks, Paul. No, it's a comprehensive answer as ever. Just in terms of, if we can maybe explore a little bit more about the, explore the data and sort of the nuances within the data a little bit more. I think what's fascinating, and you've already touched upon this in your introduction, but I think what is fascinating is not necessarily that we're just determining just general interest or, sort of volumes of interest, but it goes a lot deeper than that. I know that in your global risk perceptions newsletter, some of the variables that you use are mobilization, for instance. How eager are people to, okay, they might care about an issue, but are they actually going to mobilize around it and tell their peers around it and petition and campaign? There's also the personalization, which I think is really, really fascinating. They might care about an issue, but do they care about it and feel that it's close to home, or is it quite distant to them? Do they feel it's quite far removed in essence? Do you want to dig into that a little bit? What is it the data can tell us in more specifics?
Sure. So let me start with that you picked up on there, that we've built a number of what we could call risk indices, and so you touched on them there, of mobilization, severity, and personalization. So I've already started this by taking a swipe at traditional polling. So why don't I just keep on that nice trend and take a swipe at what I'll call generic sentiment analysis filters. I think everyone has some sort of experience trying to feed data through, and some black box says, oh, this one's positive and this one's negative. And when you work with controversial topics, and I think every one that we just put up there on the first slide would be fair to say that are controversial, it's about degrees of concern. And so, I'll use glyphosate as a in the news type of example. I think it would be very difficult to find a lot of positive conversation around glyphosate. it would be easy to be overwhelmed by the negativity, but it's important to segment, saying not all concern is equal, that some is actually personal and some people are just offended on behalf of another group, which sometimes it matters more, sometimes less. And then ultimately what we're doing is predicting mobilization. When are people actually going to move against a product? Because as we started, attitudes are important, but behaviors are what drive business outcomes and regulatory decisions. So really what we're ultimately aiming for is to understand behaviors. And so really that comes down to mobilization. So that's how we think of segmenting the content. So when we're drawing inputs from data, whether that's, we'll use an amalgam of Twitter, Facebook, news media, global search trends, as I said, and amalgamate those and try to get at what people are actually thinking there.
Now, the issues on your visual before, they're obviously big, glyphosate, GMOs, pesticides, etc. I mean, these are things that there is a fairly wide public debate around. Presumably, the tools also work for lesser issues that aren't quite on the radar to the same extent.
Yeah, so we were working with a client a year or two ago where it was at a subnational level, so fairly small population. Overall population of that region was about 10 million people, subnational, and it was a private members bill. And so the client's interest would have been harmed if this private members bill went through. And there was a couple activist groups just doing a really, give credit where credit is due. They were doing a very impressive job making it sound like millions of people cared. They had petitions and polls that showed millions of people cared. When we cut it through and saw how many people actually cared, it was 3,000 people signing a petition that were sounding like a million. And so being able to take that very fine issue that only 3,000 people cared about and being able to put that number around it, and then being able to show that data to policymakers and politicians and being able to say, we understand the pressure that you're under, believing that this to be an issue that millions care about. It's 3,000 people. Needless to say, that private members bill never went anywhere after that. So that's the type of small tactical issue where we've used the tool. You're right. I think we put a slide up and say, here's how policymakers are thinking about plastics versus GMOs versus pesticides. It's easy to see this as, okay, this is useful for grand strategy, but what else? And so I'd say that's where we drill in. The slide that we put up at the beginning there of saying, where does an issue like plastics fall in comparison to a more niche issue, I think is the starting point. But that's when, and we've done this in our work together with Rud Pedersen, is, all right, that's the starting point. Where do we drill in from there? And so you touched on before about message testing. And so that's something that probably is one of the more tangible use cases in terms of where we use the tool. That if we think about how message testing is done without a tool, you pay 18 people in a focus group to sit and you feed them a ham sandwich and you hope that those 18 people are representative of the broader sample, and you hope to goodness that they give you something gold because, man, they're expensive. And you can give them a certain type of messages, but you're not going to announce that you're withdrawing from a large product category. That's something too sensitive. You're not going to likely provide them activist messages, because then how do you weigh those two together? So those are some of the challenges that we ourselves, as a public affairs firm, had experienced with traditional focus groups. When it came time to really try to rethink this, it was saying, all right, how do we use these deep learning technologies to test messages in a different way? And so what we'll do is we'll start with that baseline. You saw the map before that says, all right, pesticides are up here in terms of here's the number of people concerned, and here's how concerned they are. And then we try different messages. And so what we're doing is using the bulk volume of thousands and thousands and thousands of social media interactions, again, all public, to start to say, how did people respond to similar type messages before? And what can we extrapolate from how they'll respond to our messages in the future? So we're doing it without actually showing real people any words, which allows you to test those sensitive messages. It also allows you to layer one on top of the other. So we were doing this for a client looking at withdrawing from a product category. The activist pressure was growing around a certain ingredient. And so then we said, okay, let's map this out and put message 1 is a government regulator says it's unsafe. Message 2, the company says we're withdrawing. Message 3, the activist says not good enough. Okay, what does that do? And you can see how concern levels will actually look.
I think, yeah, I think you pretty much answered my next question, which was exactly along the lines of what you were saying the last couple of minutes around, how is it that your clients or our clients indeed can use this data? And I know, having worked with TACTiX, the last time we worked together, it was really to help a client determine essentially what issues they should be advocating around. And I think what was really interesting there is we essentially used Paul's tools to determine how important is it that policymakers consider specific issues in relation to that industry in question, which is it's an interesting question, because it raises the specter of the sort of relevance versus expectations of people. Because if, for instance, you're in, hypothetically, you're in the tech industry, people will obviously be interested in your position on privacy, but maybe not so much on environmental matters, for instance. So again, I think the data that we can glean using your tools can really help us determine, okay, these might be the things that hit the headlines at the moment in Brussels, but how important are they actually in relation to our industry and the policymakers we speak to? So certainly in terms of determining strategy and prioritizing and prioritizing messages, they can be really useful. And I think the other thing that props up, which is arguably as important, is also we keep being told in Brussels that public perception and public opinion matters more and more and more. Of course, we live in a democracy, and so it should. But we've always slightly been shielded from the importance of public opinion here in Brussels. That's no longer the case. European Parliament's far more political, as is the Commission even. So understanding public perceptions around issues in specific constituencies, depending on who you speak to, is also obviously very important. But other maybe you can elaborate a little bit on the examples that I've just listed, but other areas where the data is useful. I'm thinking, determining. I mean, you mentioned activists before, so it's determining maybe the positions of opponents or competitors, for instance.
Sure. So let me start with one that I think a use case that a lot of people are going to go, okay, yeah, I guess that's important, but easy to dismiss. And so let me start with that one, because I think that's an important place to start. And that's the Hippocratic Oath, the first do no harm. And a lot of places where we use the tool are in that principle that I think all public affairs follows and needs to follow, is first do no harm. So we were working with a client where they had an ingredient in their product where they had some polling done. Sorry if there's any pollsters on the webinar here. We're taking a few shots here. But there was some polling done which had said that 25% of the population was strongly opposed to this. I mean, 25%, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people. That's a national, international campaign that you end up running if that's the real data. If hundreds of million people are truly concerned, then that's one type of campaign. When we went in and we saw, okay, let's not look at what people think when you put the microphone in front of them and say, are you worried about substance X turning your toenails blue? Because what they will say is, I wasn't before, but I am now. So what we had done when we said, all right, let's look at how many people are actually worried about this, looking at behaviors. And our number was 500,000 people. 500,000 people versus a couple 100 million. It's a very different type of campaign. And so if we think about that first do no harm, if you would run the type of multinational campaign that you would wanted to in the initial case, when only 500,000 people initially cared about it, all we'd end up doing is stoking the fire. So I think that's use case number one. It's not a very fun and sexy one because it's often, let's be calm and measured, but I think it's a pretty important one. The second, I'd say, use case, and it stems out of our conversation there a moment ago about message testing, is using messages that work and not messages that we want to work or feel ought to work. And I'll come back to the crop protection industry as an example. No shortage of messaging continues to say crop protection, innovative tools, help feed the world. Nobody cares about that messaging. It does not resonate. In Europe, in the United States, in Canada, at national levels, at specific levels, it does not resonate. Still is used because it's super appealing and super intuitive. And so when we run it through, we did a fairly large study which looked at a number of different messages that work and saw that around crop protection, it's climate change. Crop protection tools fight climate change. It's the one that resonates. And the reason that's going to bring me into what I'd say a third use case was we're sitting on a panel a number of years ago, and people were being asked, how does agriculture communicate with people in cities? And people were pontificating on all sorts of thoughts. And our line was, people in cities is not an audience. Women aged 25 to 35 making 80,000 euros plus or minus 20%, living in a city of 1 million people or more, that's an audience. That's something that can be segmented and customized. That trying to say, let's come up with a messaging campaign, an advocacy campaign for everybody in cities is I think, a relic of 30 years ago, 50 years ago. So that would be another, I'd say, fairly important use case of saying what actually works, don't do any harm in doing it, and actually speak to a specifically subset enough group that actually works, would be some of those use cases.
I see we're starting to get some questions in. So
okay.
Let me just I just have a couple more before I then pick out a few of these. I think one is, you were just touching upon this before. How is it that we, obviously we have the data, but then what? So for instance, I know that some of the variables that you test or determine are how many people within a specific constituency or group are interested in an issue versus how passionately they feel about it, or how often they express indignation or other emotions around it, for instance. Sort of generally, what's better? Is it having a few people feeling really, really passionately about something, or is it having lots and lots of people who sort of feel a little bit somewhat passionately about something, for instance?
I love the idea that we get to decide that. So you would have seen the slide that we put up there. Plastics is on the super far right-hand axis, which is off the charts level of engagement. A fair number of people concerned, but obviously not everybody concerned. And then there's niche issues in that we'll say top left-hand corner of a 2x2 graph that says not that many people are interested, but those who are very concerned. So I think you're right to say that those are two very different sets of concerns. Obviously, the top right-hand part of that chart, the idea of extremely large numbers of people and almost all of them are concerned. That top right-hand chart, that's your 5-alarm bell. You know, we're no longer dealing in risk communication, we're dealing in crisis communication at that point. But in terms of the other two quadrants, I think it's important to say we are where we are, that there's a certain level of humility that says plastics aren't going to magically become an issue that nobody cares about. And if there's questions that people have later about no, COVID is not the magic bullet to make the plastic sector the angel. I know there's a lot of op-eds that get written in Washington and Brussels and Toronto and Ottawa here. No, it's not the magic bullet, but that's parking lot issue. So I think it's recognizing that it's two very different sets of problems. So I'll come back to crop protection as an example and say the idea of do crop protection tools cause cancer in humans? That's a bottom right-hand issue. A lot of people are interested in that, but most people are uncertain, undecided. It's not as if the majority of the population is galvanized in opposition. So that's an issue where a lot of people care, but still there's uncertainty. And that needs to be managed in a very different way than, say, do crop protection tools cause cancer in pets? Very few people are actually engaged on that question, but those who are incredibly concerned.
Yeah.
And so I'd say a key use of the tool is saying it's easy to conflate those two issues and say both take up column inches in terms of newspapers, both look similar when you poll people and say, are you concerned? They say absolutely about both of them. But they're two very different issues. And so when I mentioned about first do no harm, those do no harm looks different for those two different sets of issues. One is don't make unnecessary number of people concerned about it when they're already highly galvanized. The other is when there's already a large number of people, what we're worried about is them suddenly becoming more concerned. So I'd say it's about moving in the direction that that people are concerned about.
And how, we say someone is in that top right-hand corner, and again, this is going to probably sound like a fairly general question, but if someone is in the top right-hand corner, can they possibly move to bottom left? Vaccines has been, I think you've done some research on vaccines, which has been really interesting, because obviously vaccines has gone from probably an area where lots of people oddly are still very concerned to now, given the crisis over the last few months, they're a lot less concerned. But clearly we've had a once in a century health crisis, and that's what's been needed to shift perceptions on vaccines. Given that obviously not everyone will have the perversely the luxury of a massive health crisis to shift perceptions. What does it take to move someone from the top right to the bottom left-hand corner?
Slow steps that I think if we think of that top right-hand corner of being extremely large number of people engaged and extremely high percentage of them concerned, at no point do we move them in a nice straight downward diagonal angle. It's very different sets of steps need to be brought to move them down a little bit, over a bit, down and over. And that sounds quite clinical and abstract, but those are two very different sets of strategies of how do we make this an issue that fewer people feel the need to be engaged with versus how do we actually persuade other people. So I use the example of climate change as a set of messages around the crop protection sector. That's a very powerful tool because the types of people, and again, this is where I come back to what I said before about segmenting an audience that say women age 25 to 34 making a certain amount of income with a certain education in a certain size of city and again, women, men, doesn't matter, you segment in a very specific way, you can imagine that type of person for whom, again, I'll come back, crop protection tools, not their favorite thing in the world. They don't love pesticides. But the single biggest issue for them is climate change. And so this is, you can imagine this type of person, and we've done the segmentation to say this is a very sizable block for whom climate change is the existential issue. And so if you think of classic psychology of risk issues, when one element gets hammered against another and you get cognitive dissonance, one has to win out over the other, and the existential threat will win out. And in that case, it's climate change. So when we start thinking about how do you move an issue from the top right, well, there's certain techniques that reduce concern, and that's the climate change example that I gave. And there's certain techniques that reduce how many people are engaged, and those are two different levers, if I can put it that way.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's the same. I mean, in our work, we're obviously, and again, this is where the data that we can glean from your tools is essential, because in our work, what we're essentially looking for is what's the strongest argument. And what your tools do is they don't just tell us, lots of people care very much about this, and they tell us what else they might care about, how personally they take an issue, the severity with which or the severity of their opinion, and this all helps us determine what we need, the storylines and the messages we need to adopt to counter it. And also in our public affairs work, when we do go and talk to policymakers who show a deep understanding of their constituents and public opinion generally, and show that we reflect the real world, not just the corporate reality or corporate desires. I will start firing some of the questions off at you that we received from people on the call. I see that both Tom and Jane have asked about the data sources. You touched upon this at the beginning. Would you care to elaborate slightly on where the data comes from?
Sure. So social interactions and engagement is the primary source. It's supplemented by how news media is interacted with, and then global search trends. Those are important levers. But I think probably the question is interested in terms of overall platforms. Twitter, in terms of being the most open, is absolutely invaluable. But Facebook is a pretty almost equal lever in that as well, in terms of feeding in content. Again, all public messages. The other platform which I'll speak about is Reddit. Reddit we use on topics where the fringe has an oversized role on shaping the conversation. So if we think about those dozen or so issues that we put up on the board, the fringe doesn't guide the conversation as much as we like to think it does, in the way that, if I could contrast it with, say, some of the social issues that are currently going on in the United States, those are types of issues where the fringe really guides the conversation. And there's nothing quite like Reddit to get at understanding what the fringe thinks. So in short, Twitter, Facebook, meld in global search trends and how people interact with news media. And when something is unbelievably polarizing, Reddit is an important tool. That's the 30-second answer.
I've got a question here from John, who asks, do policymakers and political groups also use this sort of data to determine their positions? And if not, why not? Why do they wait for public affairs people to tell them?
Yes, they do. So I know of a case of a government that made a very substantial commitment in its policy platform when it was running for election. It was, I would say, one of their 3 pillars of election to unseat the other party. And within 6 weeks of being elected, they completely dropped it. One of the three main pillars, and they completely dropped it. And they dropped it because of this tool, and they dropped it because nobody actually cared. Everybody said they cared, but when you actually looked at how many people genuinely cared, didn't matter. And so why on earth would you waste political capital on something that doesn't actually resonate with people? And so one of the three major pillars of their policy platform was dropped because of the tool.
Oh.
So yes.
So they do.
They do.
I guess, yeah, I guess presumably policymakers, political groups, etc., still rely more heavily on old school polling, like I guess most organizations do. But on that note, I mean, obviously, I guess you're no doubt biased on this, but in terms of,
I love questions that start that way. You're no doubt biased on this, but
no, but in terms of the shift from polling to AI enabled tools, I mean, you'll no doubt tell me that there's still too much polling going on, and more people should be relying on AI enabled tools such as yours. But is the shift happening relatively fast, or do you still feel that most organizations and most organizations still rely on polling and aren't too sure about all this new tech stuff?
I think it's fair to say that there's a pretty intuitive appeal of polling, that it just intuitively feels right. I mean, ignore any tools, ignore whatever of, if I want to know what you, Stefan, think about an issue, I'm going to ask you. That we are wired to, how do you find out information about something, a way somebody is going to act and think? You ask them. So polling is just doing what feels intuitive on a much bigger scale. So that's my way of saying certainly attractive, and can understand why it is still the most widely used way of going about things. But I think it's fair to say that if we drill a little deeper in terms of that personal level of, how would I, Paul, try to understand what you, Stefan, really think about an issue? I said before, it's intuitive to say that I would probably ask you and get your opinion on it. But I don't think that's actually true. It's probably much more likely that I would observe your behaviors. I would see how you acted. I mean, it's how many self-help books are filled with the idea of actions speak louder than words. But I think there's a pretty important truth to that says we know that asking people isn't the most reliable way to understand and predict behaviors. It's looking at past behaviors. So that's my hope, that intuition starts to counterbalance the intuition around polling, which is, let's ask people. So that's my non-short way of saying polling is still highly prevalent because it's comfortable.
No, absolutely. But yeah, clearly, I mean, the point is, if you ask people the question, then they'll think about it. Whereas what you do is essentially try to determine what their view is and their perception is, without actually leading them or directing them in any way, shape, or form. On that note, though, Aaron has an interesting question. He says, "Are there limitations of your tool compared to traditional polling at all?"
That's a really good question. Thanks, Aaron. And I think I know which Aaron is asking this question. So thanks for a hardball question here. Absolutely. There's a role for polling when we aren't trying to predict behaviors. When you're just trying to think, how will someone say that they think? So if we're trying and anticipating that that an activist group is going to launch a poll, and they're going to get a certain response because you can frame a question in a certain way, we may want to know that in advance. So one single advantage of polling that will always have an advantage over these types of tools is if you want a certain answer. That if you want to frame a question in a way to get you a certain answer, polling will always be more effective. That you can use push polls, you can use priming, and you can use tools that elicit a certain response. So if your goal is to wire a certain outcome, then bang on, polling's the tool to do that. So I would expect to see activist groups continue to use polling just because it is unbelievably reliable at getting an answer that you want.
I like that nuance, actually. So maybe polling is useful if what you're doing it for is PR, when you want to direct the answer so that you can get the headline that you're looking for. Whereas your tool is more useful in helping organizations behind the scenes and determining strategy or determining messaging or assessing what it is that other stakeholders active on the same issue are doing. Question from Emil. Do you use any qualitative data to better understand the data that you collect? Or do you narrow it down in any way?
So if we say qualitative, meaning does a human actually read any of the actual content? No, and it's for the reasons of GDPR that we don't. That at no point do we actually start, scanning through content and saying, let's really look at what Gene Smith said about an issue, because then that starts to violate that separation between aggregated sentiment and individual personally identifiable information. So what I'll say is that we've been using this tool now since 2015. I think my colleague Howard is on the line, and if I'm getting that date wrong, he's probably tapping his pen right now. But about 2015, point is, it was before GDPR. So when we were training the tool in terms of how to understand language and connect ideas, that was pre-GDPR, and there was a lot of qualitative work that went in and said, okay, we need to train the tool, and the data scientists that we work with need to train the tool to understand how language works. Then there was a lot of qualitative work. But now you can't connect that while still respecting GDPR.
See a question here from Jacob or Jakob, which is, how fair is your tool in predicting the popularity of specific issues?
Yeah, I assume we mean fair by accurate.
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, we'll go with that. If we want to have a question about fairness, I'll pull up my undergrad philosophy doctrine. So in terms of accuracy, highly accurate. So the tool correctly predicted the Brexit vote back in 2016. And if we think about why, it had to do with the tragic event when the MP was killed, and quite a tragic event that you can imagine when a tool is being trained to understand public perception of political issues, you don't think it has to learn about murder. And so that was a moment where, quite tragically, the tool had to learn how do people respond to that. And in fact, that was quite a key turning point. So that's a more public example. Obviously, it's challenging to be able to say we correctly got issue X right for client Y. So that's why the political proof points are helpful around that.
I see Emil, who asked the previous question around qualitative data, has fleshed out his question a little bit. He's asking, well, do you actually run interviews or focus groups to actually then test your data in any way?
Yes, so we have a separate sort of way of thinking, and we call them perception audits. And I have a colleague who is unbelievably more gifted than I am in terms of sitting down and conducting anonymized feedback. And so when a client comes in and says, we really want to understand how a stakeholder group thinks of us, say policymakers, for example, we'll run the tool in the process as one, and then another colleague of mine will actually go and have the 20 or 30 interviews that the policymakers can be assured that what they say isn't going to be tied directly to their name. We'll do a list of these 20 or 30 policymakers were talked to, and this is the overall general feedback to validate those two across. So yes, has a huge place, but not through the tool. Yeah, and that's where, so we will do that work if I could say, on our own continent, we're in our own backyard, and that's where it's wonderful to work with folks like Rud Pedersen, who have that on the ground footprint in Brussels to be able to do that type of service with. So,
thank you, Paul. We've fire away if you have any more questions. I've got a couple more. But yeah, like I say, feel free to type out your questions in chat. Everyone, I see still quite a few of you online. Just a question about sort of out of interest, really, market nuances, continent nuances. In terms of sort of risk perceptions, do you have any sort of interesting tidbits in terms of how does North American compare to Europe? How do to Asia, for instance? Again, broad, but any thoughts?
I like that this is the please are we different than the United States question, asked in different language, but this is the please are we different than the United States question. So a couple different points maybe I'd make on that. One is certainly some issue specific differences. So before, when I showed on the slide, you would have seen titanium dioxide as an issue of high concern in Europe. In contrast, in North America, titanium dioxide in sunscreens, in mineral sunscreens, is viewed as a guardian angel. It's wholly embraced by activist groups as being much better than those scary chemical alternatives in sunscreens. So that's a specific issue difference where Environmental Working Group in North America praises titanium dioxide and demonizes it in Europe, which is a fascinating corporate approach. So there's some issue differences. I'd say that there are some trigger differences. So endocrine disruptors, ED, is probably a pretty big difference in terms of does that trigger the level of public concern? In Europe, obviously, the answer is yes. In North America, if you say, I have a problem with ED, you're not actually talking about endocrine disruption. So it doesn't have that same drive there. But I think I'd also come back to, you picked up on the various different risk indices that we've built of severity and personalization and mobilization. And I think it's fair to say that between Europe and North America, there is a generally, again, broad, big picture speaking, generally there's a heavier weighting on personal risks and personalization of risks in North America versus Europe, both in terms of overall content, but also their predictiveness of mobilization. So actually, a shameless plug for the next month's risk report that'll come out next week. We're talking about what is predictive of mobilization. And you'll see which issues generally it's severity and which issues it's personalization. That's at a super macro global level. But if you were to drill in regionally, personalization is generally more effectively predictive in North America, whereas severity in Europe. But I mean, those are big picture observations.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the word trigger, which made me think of one thing I scribbled down, having read your last risk perception newsletter. You say that as professionals, we need to anticipate whether public concern will blow up or blow over, which I think is a great way of putting it. So what is a trigger that will make something, in your experience, that will make something blow up or over? Is it a case of just incremental change over time, or a short-term crisis, or does it really depend?
I think I'm going to say that the cop-out answer, of course, is that it really depends, but it does. So let me try to think of a specific example here. But maybe let's end with plastics in a time of COVID. I teach that at the beginning. So I think it's easy to say that, well, now that people are seeing medical uses of plastic, it's going to change the overall category. And that's not at all a link that we're seeing, that people view things as very discrete functions and very discrete uses. And so it doesn't have this ability to transfer over the, again, to use the language of the psychology of risk, the positive affect, the benefits piece, those positive emotions of one type of use of plastic don't translate onto other uses. So just because we now feel comfortable with masks doesn't mean that now single-use plastics are awash and we should say nobody cares about that issue anymore. So I think that's an important observation, that the positive affect, in terms of that positive emotion, can change risk perceptions in some ways. In others, there's a very strong iron curtain that it doesn't jump across.
I see there's no more questions from the group, and we've only got a couple of minutes left. So I'd suggest that we end. I mean, what I would like to say is just to stress, I think, what I said in my introduction, which is, we've done work with TACTiX now across a few projects, and really in two areas. One is this is understanding the perceptions of a narrow group, i.e. policymakers, around specific issues, which has really helped us determine the strategy, a strategy for approaching them and applying and adopting the messaging which is suitable to them, and enabling us to have an open and interesting exchange. So that's absolutely invaluable in that sense. Equally so, clearly we're in the game of politics. What matters in politics is public sentiment, public opinion. And if we are able in public affairs to understand and reflect public sentiment, we'll be far better at our jobs. And I would argue that the tools that TACTiX provide are probably at the forefront globally of helping us really understand public sentiment. So yeah, thanks so much, Paul, and great insights as always. And thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks, Stefan. Thank you, everyone.